The observation deck of the Vethrani diplomatic cruiser was not built for moments like this. It was built for ceremony, for the careful choreography of interspecies contact, for the kind of controlled, sanitized first impressions that the Vethrani High Council had spent 400 years perfecting. The walls gleamed in soft bioluminescent panels. The atmosphere was precisely calibrated, a gentle blend of nitrogen, oxygen, and trace elements designed to accommodate the widest possible range of carbon-based visitors. There were refreshment dispensers, translated welcome banners, and a team of 12 Vethrani diplomatic liaisons who had each trained for no fewer than 6 years in the art of making other species feel simultaneously welcomed and subtly inferior. It was, in short, a room built for theater, and what walked through the airlock door was, without question, the worst prop anyone had ever sent to perform in it. The human's name was Oren Mbiaye, and the suit he wore had clearly survived something that it was never designed to survive. The left shoulder plating was dented inward at an angle that suggested either a catastrophic pressure event or a very personal disagreement with something much larger than a human. 3 of the external seals along his right arm were held together with what the Vethrani translation matrix could only describe as tape. Reflective tape, at that, applied in overlapping strips with the kind of confidence that implied this was a deliberate engineering decision, rather than a desperate patch job at 3 in the morning. The helmet visor had a crack running diagonally from the lower left corner, sealed from the inside with some kind of resin that had dried in a shape vaguely resembling a river delta. The oxygen readout on the chest panel was flickering, not alarmingly, just enough to suggest it found its own accuracy more of a suggestion than a commitment. Ambassador Vorath Kell, who had spent 40 years in the Vethrani diplomatic corps and had personally overseen first contact protocols with 11 separate species, stared at this human for exactly 4 seconds before turning to his aide and saying, in their native tongue, "Did their cargo shuttle crash on the way here?" The aide, a young Vethrani named Suella Priss, checked her scanner. "No, Ambassador, this is, apparently, the designated representative." "The suit." "Yes, Ambassador." "The tape." "Yes, Ambassador." Vorath Kell straightened his collar, composed his expression into something professionally neutral, and walked forward to greet the human with the grace and dignity appropriate to his station. Behind him, the 11 other diplomatic liaisons were performing various degrees of the same exercise, with varying degrees of success. 2 of them were absolutely not suppressing smiles. One, a junior attaché named Bren, who had drawn the short straw and was standing closest to the airlock, was staring at the tape with the kind of fascination usually reserved for watching something extraordinary happen in very slow motion. Oren Mbiaye reached up, twisted the helmet release, and pulled it off with a slight grunt of effort. The crack in the visor had apparently made the seal slightly uneven, and it required a particular technique. Underneath, he was a broad-shouldered man somewhere in his mid-50s, with a close-cropped beard going silver at the edges, deep brown skin weathered by what the bioscanners indicated was a truly impressive amount of solar exposure, and the expression of someone who had slept perhaps 4 hours before getting on a ship and did not particularly consider this a problem. He tucked the helmet under his arm like a football, looked around the observation deck with the measured calm of a man who had walked into difficult rooms before, and said, "Ambassador Vorath Kell, I'm Oren Mbiaye, Earth Diplomatic Corps. Apologies for the suit. We had a situation in the Kessler Belt 3 days out, and the replacement parts didn't arrive before departure. I was told the mission timeline was non-negotiable." Vorath Kell, to his enormous credit, kept his voice completely even. "We appreciate your commitment to the schedule, Representative Mbiaye. Welcome aboard the Vethrani diplomatic cruiser Serethis. I trust your transit was manageable." "Mostly," Oren said, which was not a complete answer. They moved to the formal greeting hall, which was where the Vethrani had planned to conduct the preliminary introductions, a room with higher ceilings and better lighting and, crucially, the kind of ambient recording systems that would capture this first meeting for historical archives. Vorathkel was already composing, in the back of his mind, the particular phrasing he would use to explain the tape in the official record. Something about resource allocation priorities. Something diplomatic. What he was not composing was any genuine concern, because here was the thing about the Vethrani, and this is important, so pay attention. They were, as a species, categorically incapable of being impressed by anything they did not already understand. They were old. Not ancient, not primordial, but old in the specific way that makes a civilization begin to confuse familiarity with comprehensiveness. They had met 11 species. They had catalogued 43 more from long-range observation. They had developed an entire philosophical framework, the continuance doctrine, built on the premise that all spacefaring civilizations followed broadly similar developmental trajectories, and that the key to successful diplomacy was simply identifying where on that trajectory your conversational partner currently sat. Humans, the Vethrani had determined from 18 months of long-range observation, were early stage, aggressive, inventive, somewhat chaotic, prone to spectacular individual achievement offset by equally spectacular collective dysfunction. Interesting, certainly. Worth engaging diplomatically, definitely, but not surprising. Not in any way that mattered. The tape, therefore, was funny. Not cruelly funny. The Vethrani were not cruel, exactly, but funny in the way that a child showing up to a formal dinner with their shirt on backwards is funny. Endearing, even. Indicative of exactly the kind of charming, slightly unfinished quality that early-stage civilizations tended to display. Suella Pris sent a message to 3 colleagues during the walk from the airlock to the greeting hall. The message contained no words. It was, in its entirety, a small rendered image of a strip of reflective tape. She received back, in short order, 2 laughing responses, and one that just said no. Oren Mbiaye walked through the greeting hall with his damaged suit and his tucked helmet and his 4 hours of sleep, and he looked at the room with those calm, weathered eyes, and he did not appear to notice any of this. Or perhaps he noticed all of it and simply did not consider it relevant to the task at hand. It was genuinely difficult to tell. That, the Vethrani would later reflect, should have been the first sign. The formal introductions proceeded according to protocol. Vorathkel introduced his team, Suella Pris, Deputy Ambassador, Bren Valat, Junior Attaché, Commodore Heska Tor of the Seraphis, and 8 others whose names will become relevant later. Oren Mbiaye introduced himself, noted that he was the only human present, because the second diplomatic representative had been aboard the transport that encountered the Kessler Belt situation, and confirmed, in response to a delicate inquiry from Suella, that the second representative was fine, just somewhat shaken, and currently aboard a repair station at Waypoint 6. "And you chose to continue alone?" Suella asked. "The timeline was non-negotiable," Oren said again, in the same tone as before, as though this explained everything. Which to him it apparently did. They moved to the primary conference table for the first substantive session. The Vethrani had prepared a comprehensive presentation, the continuance doctrine framework, the terms of potential Vethrani patronage for developing civilizations, the specific resource and technology exchange protocols they were prepared to offer. It was a generous package, genuinely. The Vethrani were not predatory in their diplomacy. They simply operated from a fundamental assumption that they were the senior party in any arrangement, and that their role was to set the terms in a way that was fair but unambiguous about the hierarchy involved. Vorathkel was 3 slides into the presentation when Oren Mbiaye said, "Can I ask a question before we get into the specifics?" Vorath paused. This was, technically, not protocol. But he was a 40-year veteran, and he recognized the human pattern of wanting to establish a conversational relationship before engaging with formal material. "Of course, the continuance doctrine," Oren said, and he was looking at the presentation display, but his tone had shifted in a way that was subtle enough that it took Suella a moment to register it. "The framework that classifies civilizations into developmental stages. I've read the version your long-range observation teams distributed. Early stage, mid-stage, mature. based primarily on spaceflight duration, territorial range, and what you call conflict resolution methodology. Vorath-Kel tilted his head slightly. You've done considerable research. It's a reasonable framework, Oren said, for what it measures. He paused. I'm just curious what it does with information it doesn't measure. A very small silence. Could you elaborate? Vorath asked. Oren reached down and touched the chest panel of his suit, the flickering oxygen readout. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Vorath-Kel. This suit, he said, is 43 years old. It was built for deep excavation work in high-pressure mining environments. It is not a spacesuit. It was not designed for vacuum, and it was not designed for the temperature ranges between here and the Kessler Belt. He said this with complete calm, as though describing the weather. I modified it. Suella Priss looked at her scanner. Looked at it again. The resin on the visor, Oren continued, is a compound I synthesized from materials available on the mining transport. It has a vacuum seal rating that is technically not rated for vacuum, but it performed adequately at the pressures I encountered. The tape is a thermal regulation modification. The original suit had no external radiation shielding, so I used the reflective material to reduce heat absorption during the transit through the belt debris field. He paused. The dent in the shoulder is from a debris impact. I calculated the structural integrity was sufficient to complete the transit. I was correct. The room was very quiet. You crossed the Kessler Belt, Suella said slowly, in a non-vacuum rated mining suit that you modified with resin and tape. Yes, because the timeline was non-negotiable. Yes. Vorath-Kel looked at his deputy. Suella looked at her scanner again, as though it might have changed its mind. Bren, the junior attaché who had been staring at the tape since the airlock, had stopped breathing for a moment in a way that he would not admit to afterward. Oren Mbiaye set his helmet on the conference table with a soft, deliberate sound. I don't think the continuance doctrine accounts for that, he said. I'm not saying it's a bad framework. I'm saying you've been watching us with long-range sensors for 18 months, measuring our territorial range and our conflict history, and I'm not sure any of those measurements capture what I just described. He looked at Vorath-Kel with those calm, weathered eyes. I thought it was worth mentioning before we discuss hierarchy. Ambassador Vorath-Kel had spent 40 years in the diplomatic corps. He had navigated the Heresy expulsion crisis, the Dual Star Accord, and the 11 first contacts, 3 of which had gone badly in the early stages before he'd corrected them. He was, by any reasonable measure, a professional. He looked at the human diplomat, at the dented suit and the reflective tape and the cracked visor sealed with improvised resin, and he felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not quite unease, but was its first cousin. Perhaps, he said carefully, we should revisit the agenda. Oren Mbiaye nodded. He reached into a compartment on the suit's forearm and produced a data chip which he set on the table next to his helmet. I brought our terms, he said. The data chip sat on that conference table like it owned the place. It was a small thing. Matte gray, no markings, about the size of Vorath-Kel's thumbnail, and it should not have commanded the room the way it did, but something about the way Oren Mbiaye had produced it, without ceremony, without preamble, with the same energy as a man setting down his keys after a long day, made every Vethrani in that room look at it the way you look at something when you suddenly realize you may have fundamentally misunderstood the situation you are in. Suella Priss reached for her scanner before she caught herself. Vorath-Kel, to his credit, did not reach for anything. He simply looked at the chip, then at the human, and said, with the careful precision of a man choosing each word like he was diffusing something, "You came prepared with terms." We both did, Oren said pleasantly. That's what a negotiation is. Our presentation outlined a patronage framework. I read it 18 months ago when your observation teams first made contact with our outer relay stations. Oren folded his hands on the table. We've had time to think about it. There it was again, that subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, like a pressure change you feel in your ears before you consciously register it. Suella had been in enough high-stakes sessions to know the feeling. It was the feeling of a conversation that had been proceeding along expected lines, suddenly revealing that it had, in fact, been proceeding along entirely different lines the whole time, and you were only now noticing. She looked at Commodore Heska Tor, who commanded the Serathis and had been standing at parade rest near the far wall, with the professional stillness of someone who considered themselves decoration for diplomatic sessions. Heska Tor was not standing at parade rest anymore. She was standing at something that was technically still parade rest, but had acquired, in the last 90 seconds, a quality of attention that was considerably more pointed. Vorath Kel picked up the data chip. He examined it. He set it in the reader built into the conference table, and the display populated with a document that was, by Vethrani standards, extremely short. The Vethrani were accustomed to diplomatic terms running to hundreds of pages of nested conditional clauses and hierarchical protocols. What Oren Mbiaye had brought was 4 pages that were, Vorath Kel quickly discovered, extraordinarily specific. "You're requesting," he said after a moment, "co-equal standing in all joint operations." Yes, not associate membership in the Vethrani Continuance Network. Co-equal standing. Yes, and full technology exchange. Bidirectional, unrestricted. Yes? Vorath set the display down. He looked at Oren Mbiaye with the expression of a man who was recalibrating something fundamental. "Representative Mbiaye, we have been in contact with your civilization for 18 months. In that time, your species has not demonstrated—" "What have we demonstrated?" Oren asked. Not aggressively, genuinely, the way a professor asks a student to show their work. Vorath paused. "Your long-range observation data," Oren continued. "What does it show? Significant territorial expansion in your home system. Conflict indices that are elevated by Vethrani standards, though trending downward. Early-stage infrastructure development. Several promising theoretical frameworks in physics and materials science. Not yet what?" Another pause. Slightly longer. Oren reached up and unlatched the damaged suit's chest panel. It came away with a sound like a relieved exhale, and he set it on the table beside the helmet. Underneath, he was wearing a standard thermal underlayer, and attached to it, over his sternum, was a small device about the size of a deck of cards, matte black, with no visible controls or displays. He unclipped it and set it beside the chest panel. "Do you know what that is?" he asked. Suella ran her scanner across it. The scanner made a sound it had never made before in her presence, a kind of uncertain, cycling tone that meant it was working very hard and arriving at conclusions it did not know how to categorize. "It's a gravity regulator," Oren said, before she could formulate a response. "Personal scale. Took us about 11 years to miniaturize it to that size after we cracked the theoretical framework. We've been using them in deep mining operations for about 6 years now. Useful when you're working in variable gravity environments and you need your tools to stay where you put them." He looked around the table. "I'm guessing your scanner hasn't seen that technology before." Suella looked at her scanner, then at the device, then at Vorath Kel. "No," Vorath said quietly. "It has not. We didn't think so." Oren reached into the suit's other forearm compartment and produced 3 more items, setting them on the table with the methodical calm of a man unpacking a briefcase. A thin filament coil that glimmered in a color that wasn't quite any color the room's lighting could account for. A small, flat disc that, when it touched the table surface, caused every loose object within 30 centimeters to slide precisely 2 centimeters away from it. And a sealed vial containing a liquid that appeared, to Suella's deeply confused scanner, to be simultaneously at 3 different temperatures. "The filament," Oren said, "is a room temperature superconductor. Synthesized, not discovered. We worked out the production process about 4 years ago. The disk is a passive resonance dampener. We use them in seismic monitoring, mostly, but they have other applications. The vial is a phase-stable coolant we developed for fusion containment. It's a lot more interesting than it looks." Vorath Kel was not moving. Bren, the junior attaché, had abandoned all pretense of professional composure and was staring at the table's contents with open astonishment. Commodore Heska Tor had taken 3 steps forward from the wall without, it appeared, deciding to do so. The continuance doctrine, Oren said, and his voice was still completely even, still that same unhurried cadence. Measures what civilizations do with their conflicts and their territory. It doesn't measure what they do in the quiet, the unglamorous work, the 11 years of miniaturization, the material science that doesn't make headlines. He looked at Vorath. We're not early stage, Ambassador. We've been early stage adjacent by your metrics, because we spend a lot of our energy underground and in deep space and in laboratories, and those aren't things that show up well on long-range observation sensors. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Suella Priss, who was a precise and careful professional, and who would later be slightly mortified by this, said out loud to no one in particular, "How long have you had this?" The gravity regulator. About 6 years operational, 11 in development. Oren picked it up and clipped it back onto his underlayer with the ease of long habit. The superconductor, 4 years. The coolant, 7. We've got other things. Some of them are more interesting than these. A pause. Some of them are considerably more interesting than these. Vorath Kell leaned forward and placed his hands flat on the table. He was, Oren thought, a genuinely impressive diplomat, because the thing he did in the next 10 seconds, instead of any of the dozen less skillful things he could have done, was simply sit with the new information. He did not deflect. He did not reframe. He looked at the objects on the table, and he thought, and then he said, "Why didn't you lead with this?" It was, Oren reflected, exactly the right question. "Because we wanted to know how you'd treat us without it," Oren said. "If you'd walked us into a genuine partnership conversation from the beginning, we'd have shown you everything on day one. But if the default assumption was that we were junior partners who needed guidance," he gestured at the items on the table, "we needed to understand who we were actually dealing with." A long silence. Considerably longer than the previous ones. Vorath Kell sat back. He looked at the damaged suit, the cracked visor, the strips of reflective tape. He looked at them differently now, not as evidence of limitation, but as something else entirely. A man who could build a personal gravity regulator had crossed a debris field in a patched mining suit because the timeline was non-negotiable, because a meeting mattered, because showing up was not optional. "The suit," Vorath said slowly. "Yeah." For the first time, something that was almost a smile crossed Oren Mbiaye's face. "We had a real spacesuit. It was destroyed in the Kessler Belt incident with my colleague. I had the mining rig, the materials on the transport, and 14 hours before I missed the rendezvous window." He glanced at the patched shoulder. "I've done harder things." Heska Tor, the Commodore, spoke for the first time since the session began. Her voice was level, but there was something under it, a quality that in Vethrani emotional registers sat very close to respect. "You calculated the structural tolerances of an unrated suit for vacuum transit in 14 hours. I had help," Oren said. "I was on comms with our engineering team on Waypoint 6 the whole transit. 41 people running simulations in real time." He paused. "That's the other thing the continuance doctrine doesn't measure. We don't solve problems alone. We're not actually good at alone. We're spectacular at networks. 41 engineers on a comm channel at 2 in the morning, running vacuum tolerance models for a suit that was never supposed to be in vacuum, because one man needed to get to a meeting." A brief pause. Nobody asked them to. They just showed up. Suella Priss was quiet. She was thinking about the message she'd sent to 3 colleagues with the image of the tape. She was thinking about the laughing responses she'd received. She was experiencing, with considerable discomfort, the specific sensation of having laughed at something that had turned out to be a completely different thing than she thought it was. Vorath Kell looked at her, reading her expression with the ease of long professional familiarity. Then he looked at the data chip, still loaded in the table's reader. He looked at the 4 pages of terms: co-equal standing, bidirectional technology exchange, full partnership. He looked at the objects arranged on the table between them, glimmering and patient. He said, I need to consult with the High Council before I can respond formally to your terms. Of course, Oren said. That will require approximately 72 hours. We have time. Vorathkel stood. The room stood with him, the way rooms do when the most senior person in them moves with purpose. He gathered himself. 40 years of diplomatic training, the full weight of the Vethrani Continuance Network's institutional gravity, every tool in an arsenal that was, he was now uncomfortably aware, somewhat less comprehensive than he had believed this morning. Then he did something that Bren the junior attaché would describe, in a message to 7 friends that evening, as the most unexpected thing he had ever witnessed in a professional setting. Vorathkel reached across the table and picked up the cracked helmet. He turned it over in his hands. He looked at the resin sealant, the improvised compound, dried in its river delta shape, doing a job it was never designed to do because someone had needed it to. Who synthesized this? He asked. I did, Oren said. With some guidance from the engineering team. Vorath set the helmet down carefully. In 14 hours, about 9 actually. The other 5 were for the structural calculations. A quiet moment. Then Vorathkel said, with the particular precision of a man meaning exactly what he says, "The Vethrani High Council will hear your terms, Representative Mbiaye. I will present them myself, with my personal recommendation." He paused. I will need to revise several elements of the continuance doctrine framework before I do. The current version has some significant gaps. Oren Mbiaye picked up his helmet. He looked at the cracked visor, the resin seal, the river delta pattern of 9 hours of improvised chemistry under pressure. Then he looked at Vorathkel, the career diplomat, the 40-year veteran, the man who ran the room, and the thing that crossed his face was not triumph. It was not satisfaction in any pointed sense. It was, simply, the expression of a man who had shown up, done the work, and found, on the other side of it, exactly what he'd come for. I appreciate that, he said. And for what it's worth, Ambassador, we're looking forward to what you bring to the table too. This isn't us replacing a hierarchy with an inverse one. We genuinely want to know what 40 years of your diplomatic experience looks like when it's applied to problems we both have. He tucked the helmet back under his arm. There's a debris field about 3 light-years out that neither of our current technologies handles particularly well. I've got some ideas. I'm betting your engineers do too. Vorathkel looked at him for a long moment. Yes, he said. I expect they do. Suella Priss walked out of that conference room and stood in the corridor for 30 seconds before she sent another message to her 3 colleagues. This one also had no words. It was the same image as before, the strip of reflective tape. But this time, instead of a laughing response, what came back from all 3 of them was a long silence, and then, from one, just that, just, oh, which was, all things considered, the appropriate response. Bren the junior attaché went back to the airlock bay that evening, ostensibly to review the docking seals. What he actually did was stand in front of the battered mining suit, which had been left on a rack near the pressure doors, and look at it for a while. The dented shoulder, the tape, the visor with its careful, improvised seal. He took one photograph. He kept it for the rest of his career, and in the Vethrani High Council chamber, 72 hours later, Ambassador Vorathkel stood before 17 of the most powerful diplomatic minds in the Continuance Network and said, with the full weight of his 40 years behind him, "We have been watching them from the wrong distance." He set the data chip on the council table. "I recommend we get closer.